Okay, welcome everyone. It's great to see you here at the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion. My name is Lee Beck. I'm the Senior Director for Europe at the Clean Air Task Force. For those of you who don't know us, we're a global climate organization focusing on overlooked solutions globally. And I'm really excited to welcome you to our next panel, Beyond Biofuels, What It Will Take to Decarbonize Aviation, which is part of our programming here at Zero Carbon Future, where we're really investigating the hard questions at the nexus of energy access, energy security, and climate for a zero carbon future. So if you'd like to get engaged in the conversation, we're going to have a couple of presentations, and then we're going to dive into an interactive conversation. So I hope the audience is ready for Q&A. Please also tweet at us as @CleanAir, CATF, with the hashtag ZeroCarbonFuture. So most of us had to fly here to get here. Aviation accounts for about 2% of emissions globally. It's seen as a hard-to-decarbonize sector, and so far has relied on biofuels to reduce emissions. However, as we're going to find out in our flagship presentation today by our very own Global Director for Transportation Decarbonization, Jonathan Lewis, the sector will need additional solutions and much more diverse options, as well as more innovation to fully decarbonize. So I'm really honored to welcome Jonathan Lewis, our Global Director for Transportation, to give the opening presentation and also present a recently released report of ours. Then we'll also have a presentation from Clara Bowman, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Highly Innovative Fuels, a company who has really exciting e-fuel projects globally. And we'll also have a video message and video presentation from Stukas, who is the Vice President for Business Development and Carbon Engineering. And with this, Jonathan, please.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Clara, for being here. I'm really excited about the conversation that we'll be having today around aviation decarbonization, which is sometimes often referred to as the most challenging piece of the transportation decarbonization challenge. So I'll be speaking, Clara will be speaking. As Lee mentioned, we'll be hearing from our colleague Stukas from Carbon Engineering via video. And then, as Lee mentioned, we're looking forward to a lively conversation with all of you following the presentations. So, a little bit about CATF. Lee already described who we are. We're trying to change the narrative to communicate the totality of solution requirements. We're trying to change the technology so that we have a full suite of options, or change business models, because the models that we're using now are not delivering solutions that will drive reductions deep enough or fast enough. And we're spending a lot of time trying to change policy, because the policies we have are also not conducive to the changes in the market that we'll need to see. All of those changes are going to be essential to aviation decarbonization. As Lee mentioned, we just produced a paper called Decarbonizing Aviation, Challenges and Opportunities for Emerging Fuels. The key takeaways are that aviation significantly contributes to global warming. It needs to be on a pathway to full decarbonization. Just because aviation is especially challenging does not mean it's exempt from the requirement that all major industries eliminate their emissions by mid-century. It can be done, and it needs to be done. So far, the major strategy for decarbonization in the aviation sector, at least in theory, has been a reliance on biofuels. As our paper points out, and as I'll be discussing shortly, the supply of biofuels falls well short of the energy demand from the aviation sector. So we need to innovate. Full decarbonization of the sector is going to require the development and deployment of scalable zero-emission fuels. And I'll explain a little bit more about what those are as we proceed here. So starting off with the major question of energy demand, climate impacts of the different options, and the role of biomass-derived sustainable aviation fuels. So just for context, 15 to 20% of global warming pollution comes from vehicles. As you can see, the emissions from the transportation sector have been growing steadily during this century. And under the two scenarios that IEA, the NZE, the net zero emissions, and the announced pledges scenario, aviation plays somewhere between 14-15% of total emissions within the transportation sector. It's not as big as light-duty vehicles or trucks, but it is a significant share of the transportation challenge. We cannot fully decarbonize the transportation sector unless we grapple with the challenge presented by aviation. As Lee mentioned, it's about 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. It's about 2% of global CO2 emissions. It's been increasing rapidly during the previous decade and unabated without policies and technologies to address aviation's emissions combined with what looks to be a rapid increase in demand. It could triple by mid-century unless we take steps to reduce those emissions. Commercial aviation accounts for the vast majority of greenhouse gases from the sector, but freight transport also makes up a significant share. And the majority of these emissions come from three markets: the United States, Europe, and China. So the strategies for decarbonizing aviation are in large part still theoretical. There are commercial investments being made, but very little has changed on the ground in terms of the fuels that are actually going into planes and the requirements around aviation emissions and aviation fuel use. Demand reduction could play a role. That could come in the form of discouraging air travel or deploying planes that are more efficient and use less fuel per kilometer traveled. Carbon offsets are often referred to as a strategy here, but there are a lot of questions around the efficacy of carbon offsets, the permanence of carbon offsets, and the certainty around the carbon offsets that are being claimed. Even if those two strategies are wildly successful, we are still going to need to decarbonize the energy that we put in the planes. And so fuel shifting is going to be a critical piece of the solution set here. Aviation energy demand has a pretty weird looking graph right now, as are most commodity graphs that include the pandemic. So they fell off dramatically and then are expected to climb dramatically during the 2020s. And then they'll continue on what looks like a fairly robust increase through the 30s and the 40s. We looked at, for the report that we put out, we looked at 4 sources of data on aviation sector energy demand: DNV, EIA, OPEC, and IEA. And interestingly, EIA from the U.S. Energy Department and IEA have slightly higher projections by mid-century than the other two. So, as we mentioned, when we talk about discussions around aviation decarbonization tend to center on sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs. And when you look at what people mean when they talk about SAFs, for the most part, they're talking about biofuels. And biofuel production around the world right now is, the vast majority of it comes from feedstocks that require significant land and water energy inputs. In the United States, for example, that tends to be ethanol made from corn. In Europe, there's a lot of rapeseed, canola oil. Out of Southeast Asia, there's a lot of palm that's going into the production of biofuels. All those crops are efficient in terms of their ability to produce material that's convertible to energy, but they all have serious, very significant requirements, particularly for land, but also for water and nitrogen inputs. So far, the aviation industry, I should say, is focused on, when it talks about sustainable aviation fuels and the role of biofuels within that context, they're mainly talking about waste-based biofuels, so biofuels that are made from farm waste or municipal waste or waste gases and then converted into biofuels. There are different advantages to that approach. A lot of those, if you're interrupting a waste stream that would otherwise oxidize its carbon in the form of CO2 or methanate it as methane into the atmosphere, you're interrupting an emission cycle. And so the net climate impact of those fuels can be neutral or even beneficial. However, we've yet to massively scale up a biofuels production stream that's built in this way. All of our success, such as it is in the biofuel space, has been around these massively scalable farm crops that use land, water, and nitrogen inputs. So that leads us to, that led us to sort of dig into, well, how much can we scale biofuels, particularly in the context of aviation fuels? And the data were right there for us. Once we dug in, we found that the estimated production of biofuels in 2030 by IEA, which has been fairly bullish about biofuels over the years, is 11.1 quads per year in 2030. That's about a 3x increase over current production. That falls well short. It's less than 70% of estimated aviation energy demand in 2030, and roughly half of energy demand from the aviation sector in 2050. And a key challenge with this industry, with this scale-up challenge, as I mentioned before, the aviation industry is mainly focused, at least nominally focused, on the use of waste biomass as a feedstock for aviation fuel. There are, as I mentioned, great benefits to using waste. However, waste is an inelastic commodity. You can't get more of it because you want more of it. There's only so much of it. And so we can't double the amount of biofuels that we think we may be able to produce just because aviation demand has gone up to 21 quads. All this leads to a couple key points. We would need to quadruple or quintuple our biofuels supply. That'll be challenging. Right now, the systems that we're using to make biofuels are already bumping up against sustainability thresholds. And another implication of this report is that this assumes that all biofuels are going to the aviation sector. Right now, very little biofuel is going to the aviation sector. We're using it for things like light-duty transportation, other heavy-duty industries like the shipping industry is increasingly focused on biofuels, often in the form of methanol, which can be made as an e-fuel, but right now is mainly conceived of or produced as a biofuel from biomass. And so not only do we not have enough of it, but we would also, even to produce a significant share of aviation energy demand through biofuels, we would have to come up with policies or commercial mechanisms to steer all of our biofuel to this one sector. That may make sense, but right now we don't have the tools to do that. So what we do need are scalable zero-emission fuels. I'm going to run through a handful of those SZEFs, scalable zero-emission fuels, the first of which is hydrogen. So hydrogen is the simplest, most abundant element in the universe. It can be a versatile carbon-free energy carrier. We can make it in a bunch of ways. You can make it by electrolyzing water, that is applying electricity to water and splitting the hydrogen from the oxygen. And that is a net zero emission fuel if the electricity that you use to do that electrolytic process is derived from a zero carbon energy source. So that could be renewables, it could be nuclear, it could be super hot rock. There's several ways to do this. Currently it's expensive, but those costs are expected to come down. Another way is to decompose methane molecules. Methane is CH4. There's a lot of hydrogen in there. You can use steam to separate the carbon from the hydrogen. And that can be a very low emissions process, provided you capture the carbon that comes out of that system and you source that methane from gas fields that have very low methane leak rates. The benefits of hydrogen as an aviation fuel is that there's no carbon atoms in aviation, so there's no CO2 when you convert it to energy. It's a fairly energy-dense fuel, by mass at least. It's volumetrically, it's a different story, a little more challenging. The challenges are that you would need new kinds of aircraft, new types of airframes to accommodate the larger size of your fuel storage systems. It's currently expensive to make hydrogen in a zero carbon way. Hydrogen itself is a small, very energetic molecule that's part of what makes it a good energy source, but it also means that your systems for making, moving, and using hydrogen need to be designed specifically for hydrogen to make sure we're not losing any of it. And regardless of what system you're using, whether you're doing electrolysis or steam methane reforming, it's an energy-densive product. You have to put a lot of energy in to get the energy that you want. So another type of alternatives to biofuels that we'll hear a lot more about shortly is synthetic fuels, which are drop-in ready aviation fuels that are made using CO2 and hydrogen as feedstocks. And so, hydrocarbons are a combination of hydrogen and carbon. And so the question becomes, where can we get those? We can pull those up out of the ground from petroleum, or we can build them from those two building blocks derived from other places. So there's multiple production options for synthetic fuels. One that I've described here is to obtain the carbon from the atmosphere using a technology called direct air capture, which is essentially a fan that's run through a system which pulls the carbon out of the atmosphere and pulls it down and either sequesters it underground as a way of carbon removal, or provides that carbon as a feedstock that can then be combined with the hydrogen. We've already talked about how to make hydrogen, and synthesizing that into a kerosene chain. The benefits are that there can be lower or no greenhouse gas emissions from the production and use of synthetic aviation fuels. It's a drop-in fuel. It's fully compatible with our existing systems for moving and using aviation fuel in the aviation sector. And depending on how you're producing it, particularly how you're making the energy to run your hydrogen production system or your carbon capture system, it can be a fairly land efficient production process. You don't necessarily need a lot of land. There are versions of ways, there are ways to power these systems that do use a lot of land. There are also ways to power these systems that don't require a lot of land. So it has a potential advantage, at least relative to biofuels, in that sense. They're currently expensive. Those costs are likely to come down, but they're pretty high right now. And the processes for making both hydrogen and capturing carbon are energy intensive. These systems only work in a climate context if all that energy is low or zero carbon. So electricity can also power aviation. Usually we talk about aviation as a difficult or impossible sector to electrify. That's not strictly true. We can fly planes on batteries. They just can't go very far and they can't be very big. But there may be a market for short hop aviation that is powered by batteries. The merits are obvious. The pros, there's, depending on how you make that electricity, there can be almost no GHG emissions associated with it. Electric motors are quiet. As someone who lives under the pathway of big jets out of Logan Airport, that would be nice. But batteries, the problem with batteries, of course, is that they cannot support medium and long haul flights or large airplanes without significant reductions in size and weight, reductions that we don't necessarily see as being on the table, at least for a very long time. So, transportation transportation presents a bunch of difficult challenges for decarbonization. Aviation is probably the biggest, most difficult challenge within that space. We've found that we cannot use biofuels alone to meet aviation sector energy demand. We're going to need alternatives to biofuels, including scalable zero-emission fuels and potentially electric propulsion. To get those tools, we're going to have to build smarter policies. So we need coherent, ambitious policies that accelerate carbon efforts in aviation decarbonization, generate demand for low and zero carbon alternatives, and emphasize coordination and collaboration to multiply the impact of these policies globally. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but in our report, we've got a mix of policy suggestions for both Europe and the United States. And you'll see on all of these slides that research, development, and deployment is a key part of the strategy. We need to, we don't have the biofuels we need. If we're going to rely on biofuels to help decarbonize aviation, we need better biofuels. We need better ways of producing them. We need better ways of converting them. We need better ways of moving them. And we also probably need, this is in an RD&D challenge, but we're also going to need policies that preference those biofuels for aviation rather than other sectors which have more options for reducing their emissions. We're going to need a handful of regulations to manage the higher costs, at least in the near and midterm. And one policy that looks interesting for managing higher costs, and it's a policy that's gotten some traction in Europe, are contracts for differences, which essentially pay down the difference between conventional fuels and alternative fuels, in which some entity, the government in most cases, picks up that difference and pays that out over time. There are ceilings and floors on those payouts, but it looks to be an efficient way of managing incremental cost differences, at least in the near term. We need a lot of investment in RD&D in the fuels, and we need a lot of RD&D in aircraft. There are emission benefits that can be achieved from more efficient, better designed airframes. So regardless of the fuels that we're using, we can wring out some more reductions just through better airframes. But we're also going to need fairly different, perhaps very different airframes to accommodate hydrogen if hydrogen does emerge as a viable aviation fuel. In the United States, again, we need a lot more research, development, and deployment at places like US DOT and DOE. Some of that's happening. A lot more of it needs to happen if we're going to decarbonize this sector. We need tax credits. There's a big one in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 for sustainable aviation fuels. And as I mentioned before, sustainable aviation fuels is usually a stand-in phrase for biofuels. What's interesting and we think promising about the definition of sustainable aviation fuel in the Inflation Reduction Act is that it very explicitly applies to fuels beyond biofuels, hydrogen-based fuels, synthetic fuels. And so we think that's important. We think that's a good model for policymaking in general, to focus on performance and be agnostic around the pathway to that performance. We are concerned that the SAF tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act could drive a lot of biofuel production, and we're trying to figure out ways to create guardrails around that. But there are aspects of this policy that will be useful. In the United States, we think that a clean fuel standard is a great way to drive down reductions across a bunch of different transportation markets. And at least for the on-road sector, the version of a clean fuel standard is what we call a zero carbon fuel standard. And California has a low carbon fuel standard. It requires 20% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030. What we want to do on the federal level is create a policy that tracks California through 2030 and then linearly declines to zero by 2050. That should organize the market and let producers within the market know what they need to do to earn credits or face regulation over a very long time planning horizon. We think that a program like that could work for aviation. The question that we're working on at CATF is whether or not a federal zero carbon fuel standard should apply to all transportation fuels, or whether we break it out for on-road policies, or for on-road fuels, aviation fuels, perhaps marine fuels. So I'm going to just wrap up by quoting the president of the International Civil Aviation Organization, an organization that has been sort of slow, I think, to push and ultimately require the emission reductions that this sector needs to see. Despite that reticence from ICAO, he recently said the introduction of radical disruptive technology is going to be needed to decarbonize aviation. We fully agree. What we're seeing so far is not radically disruptive technology. It's sort of a repurposing of conventional biofuels for a new market. We think we can do a lot better than that. We think we need to do a lot better than that. We need an entirely different, more ambitious approach. We need cohesive, inclusive national and global strategy focused on the deployment of truly low-carbon aviation fuels, scalable zero-emission fuels, and electric propulsion. We need all of it. We need all of it to be as low-carbon as possible, and we need to do a lot of both innovation work and deployment work to get where we need to be. So with that, I will turn it over to Clara. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and what a great introduction to what I'm going to share with you guys today. So, our company is called HIF Global, and we are looking to decarbonize the transport sector in general through the production of low-carbon, scalable e-fuels. What you can see here is the plant that we're building and in fact commissioning right now in Chile in the south of Latin America. I'm not going to spend too long on what e-fuels are because I think that there was just a great explanation of that and I don't want to take too much of your time. But I do want to just give a quick overview for those who haven't heard about it before and might be assisted by the diagram. We basically take carbon dioxide that's either present already in the air or somehow captured from industry, carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere already one way or the other, and we combine that with green hydrogen in a reactor. In our particular process, we do that to make methanol, and methanol can be thought of as kind of the Lego block of carbon-based fuels. Once you have a methanol block, you can then put it into another reactor, and depending on your catalyst, you can make gasoline or even shorter LPG. You can make diesel, all the things that can be used in the petrochemical industry. And of course, what we're here to talk about today, sustainable aviation fuel. And so the beauty of that is that you have a single pathway to produce a product which is exactly the same as fossil methanol, but green. And then from that, you can do a whole host of applications to start decarbonizing the transport sector and the petrochemical sector. And so basically everything that we do today with oil, which is a multi-trillion-dollar industry that needs to be completely displaced between here and 2050, we believe that tomorrow you can do with e-fuels. So here is a picture of, or a video of the plant that we're building at the moment in the south of Chile. You can see that we've got the wind turbine, which will be the source of renewable energy, and then that will track through the whole process. And in this case, we're actually producing gasoline, and so that gasoline will be used by Porsche, who are one of the partners in the project, to be able to decarbonize their racing events that they have around the world. And we'll also be producing at that facility methanol. Methanol is a potential shipping fuel. So why did we choose a place like the south of Chile to have our first plant? And that's because it's one of the best renewable energy locations in the world. It has a plant factor for wind that is 70% plus, which if you're a equipment manufacturer, I'm looking at some people nodding here, that is really, really, really good wind. And that means that we have a very high utilization of all of the infrastructure that goes downstream of that to ultimately have the lowest cost possible product. But we aren't only doing things in Chile, where we have 15 gigawatts of wind in development. We saw that this is a global problem and requires a global solution. So we have an office in Houston where we're developing 3 world-scale plants, the first of which is a 14,000 barrel per day facility that we want to start construction on next year to produce shipping and road transport fuel. And the idea of that is to be producing in 2026. The next project that we have beyond that is in fact to produce sustainable aviation fuel. And so you might ask why we didn't lead with sustainable aviation fuel, because I think that there's a very clear need. There's additional tax credits that are available for it as well. And the reason for that is that there is still a little bit of a lag in terms of the certification of this type of fuel. So there's 2 ways that you can produce e-jet. One is called the Fischer-Tropsch process, and that has been certified. The other is to go through the methanol to jet process that I described earlier, and that process has not yet been certified by the International Aviation Transport Association. So that's something that we're working on, and that's why it'll be our second plant in the United States that will actually be dedicated towards renewable aviation fuel. We're also developing projects in Australia. So our mission is to basically go wherever there is a plentiful amount of renewable energy, develop it out at scale, and drive down the costs so that we can be producing millions of tons of low-carbon fuel as soon as possible. And what does that mean? As a company, for our 2030 targets, we're looking to do the equivalent of converting 5 million passenger vehicles to carbon neutral. Of course, that doesn't have to just be passenger vehicles. That could be ships, that could be planes, but that's to give you an idea of the kind of scale that we're talking about. That means producing 3.1 million tons per year of green hydrogen. It means 150,000 barrels per day of e-fuel production and $50 billion worth of investment across the different phases. And what's most important, 25 million tons of carbon capture per year that we will be achieving as part of the rollout of our facilities. And so, yeah, thank you very much for your time today and for this great opportunity to be able to share with you what we're doing as a company. And I'm really looking forward to the next presentation as well to learn more about carbon engineering's advances in direct air capture, which is a critical part, we think, of our processes going forward. While there are industrial applications for capturing CO2, there are some kind of linked to bio applications as well. The real holy grail of us being able to do electrofuels at scale around the world is being able to get direct air capture costs down so that that can be the central part of how we're producing those fuels going forward. Thanks very much.
Next, we're going to play a video from Anna Stukas from Carbon Engineering. I think, oh, yeah, maybe we have to do it. That's a good one.
Hi, my name is Anna Stukas. I'm one of Carbon Engineering's Vice Presidents of Business Development. Here at Carbon Engineering, my role involves working together with our technical and business teams to bridge the gap between technology and commercialization. And I also focus on our business development efforts on the global aviation industry and how direct air capture can help aviation get to net zero. Carbon Engineering is a climate solutions company. We're based in Squamish, British Columbia, Canada, and our core expertise is a technology that allows us to capture carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. From there, we can either put that carbon dioxide back underground where it came from, or we can combine it with clean hydrogen to create products like sustainable aviation fuel. We were founded in 2009 and have been working since 2015 at our pilot plant in Squamish, British Columbia. Today, we're working together with partners like 1.5 to deploy our technology at commercial scale, including our first commercial project that's targeted for deployment in Texas that is aiming to capture 500,000 tons per year of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and put it safely and securely back underground where it came from. Direct air capture is using technology to capture carbon dioxide molecules directly out of the air around us, giving it that name of direct air capture, or DAC. Any engineer can't resist the three-letter acronym. Our technology borrows from industrial equipment or existing industries and combines those together with very simple chemistry in novel ways to capture that carbon dioxide and concentrate it into an almost pure form so that we can then do things with it, like put it back underground or turn it into fuels. Direct air capture is absolutely critical when we think about the tools in our toolbox that we need to address the climate change challenge. Experts like the IPCC tell us that we are going to need billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal if we are going to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So what does that mean? We live in an interconnected equilibrium system. The atmosphere, the oceans, and the biosphere are all connected together, and we see flows of carbon from one to the other all the time. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been throwing that cycle out of balance by adding new carbon dioxide from the geosphere, or from underground, into the system that we live in. That increase is what's contributing to climate change and global warming. So when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, and in particular permanent carbon dioxide removal. We're talking about taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and out of this equilibrium system that we live in and putting it back underground where it came from so that we can help restore balance to the earth where we live. Direct air capture can help aviation to decarbonize in two ways. First of all, by combining atmospheric carbon dioxide with clean hydrogen, we can essentially create fuel for use in aviation out of the air, basically recycling that CO2 over and over again, rather than pulling new CO2 out of the ground. The second piece and critical role that DAC can play is that permanent carbon removal piece, which can help to counterbalance any residual emissions that are remaining from the aviation sector. So that ability to provide synthetic fuel, synthetic jet fuel, is an incredible, powerful tool as we look to how we help aviation get to net zero. What that means overall is that we can reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel that we're using in planes by 70 to 90%, depending on the configuration that you're using at commercial scale. When we think about the logistics of starting to produce sustainable aviation fuel at scale, I like to think about it as there kind of being three legs of a stool that you need in order to stand that stool up. The first of which is that we need to make sure that there is known and predictable demand for those fuels. That's where market-based mechanisms, things like the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, like SAF mandates, can be an incredibly powerful tool for sustainable aviation fuel producers to know that there are going to be policies that are going to create demand for their fuels over time and help to close the green premium. Anytime we're thinking about those standards, it's absolutely imperative that we design them to be performance-based and that we design them to focus on rewarding reductions in carbon intensity. We need to look at rewarding the outcomes that we're looking for rather than being prescriptive. Because anytime we're prescriptive, the only thing we can guarantee is that technology and innovation are going to outpace the rate at which we can change the standards and the regulations for them to keep up. The second leg of the stool that we need is some way of backstopping that market risk. There's a fantastic example of how you can do that by looking at what's happening in the US today with the Inflation Reduction Act and the combination of the 45Q tax credits for direct air capture and carbon capture, the 45V tax credits for clean hydrogen production, and the SAF blenders tax credit. And the combination of those three tools can be incredibly powerful to help to backstop the market risk and help producers know that there's going to be revenue available. And really, I think it's fair to say that the Inflation Reduction Act has really set the gold standard around the world that all other governments now need to be looking to measure up to if they want to be competitive. That third leg of the stool that we need is help with getting first projects over the line. With any large technology deployment, the first project is always going to cost more and have higher risk. To help to get these projects over the line, and we're talking large-scale infrastructure projects like the one that you see behind me, we need capital that's capable of taking that first plant risk. Getting aviation to net zero is going to be a huge challenge. It's also a huge opportunity. And it's important to remember as we're tackling that challenge and that opportunity that we make sure that we're leveraging all of the tools in our toolbox to make sure that we're doing it as efficiently and effectively as possible.
Great, thank you, Anna. May I ask the panelists to join us on stage? Perfect. Great. Thank you, everyone, again for being here. Please start thinking of your questions as well and signal to me if you'd like to jump in with a question. We're hoping this can be an interactive conversation. I want to start with you, Jonathan. One of your slides really stuck with me, which said demand reduction, maybe, biofuels, maybe, new innovation, definitely needed. Can we talk a little bit about, especially against the backdrop of most of us having to fly here, and kind of this idea of flight shaming having gained a lot of traction over the past couple of years. Why do we think that demand reduction is not actually a viable strategy for long-term aviation sector transformation?
Thanks, Lee. There's a lot that we can do as people who do fly regularly to reduce our aviation-related emissions, and there are people doing good work trying to figure out ways that we can get places without flying, or ways that we can reduce those emissions, on a personal level. The key point, however, is that the vast majority of the people on this planet never fly anywhere. Those people are hopefully growing up in regions and economies that are developing economically, and they're growing up in a context of deeper and deeper globalization. So in this more affluent, more interconnected world, we should expect to see a much larger portion of human residents of this planet to take advantage of aviation transport services. It's become a fact of life in the global north. We could do a better job, but I think aviation is part of our basic mode of living, and I think that some of that, even if only a little tiny bit of that, will be part of the economy and the lives of emerging countries, emerging economies as well. And so, even if we level out or slightly reduce demand for aviation services in the global north, I expect we'll see a significant growth for aviation services in the developing world, and that results in a large net increase in energy demand from the sector.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think, it's really important also to focus on the scale of the challenge at the moment. Jet fuel demand globally is about 8 million barrels a day pre-pandemic. This is only going to rise. As you say, the majority of people don't actually fly anywhere. So Clara, I'd love to understand, you laid out in your vision 150,000 barrels of gasoline equivalent, I think, a day you're looking to produce by 2030. What does the sector need to scale to that kind of fuel equivalent?
Well, I think that the first step was the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. That was tremendously helpful. We are more expensive than fossil fuels, and we will be for at least the medium term, and hopefully after that the cost can reduce as we start to do this more at scale, and things like electrolyzers, which really are in their infancy in terms of mass manufacturing, will be able to reduce their cost and also increase their efficiency. So that's stuff that we're seeing as we talk with electrolyzer manufacturers, and that's a huge part of our overall cost, is the cost of hydrogen. So in the IRA, for example, we have the tax credits for the carbon capture, although there is a small point there that could be very helpful, which is that right now you get a higher carbon credit for capturing and sequestering than you do for capture and use. And so we kind of look at ourselves as indirectly sequestering, because as a result of us using the carbon to make fuel, there's petroleum that's staying in the ground where it's been safely sequestered for the past 250 million years. And so we really don't think that we should be at a disadvantage. When we go to someone and we say, hey, we want to capture your CO2, we feel like we should be on a level playing field with people who are sequestering that CO2. So that's a small tweak that we're hoping to see as that legislation continues to improve. But overall, it's a great step forward in us being able to compete or produce a product that at the end is going to be able to be used without a significant extra cost for our clients. And And so I think that it's steps like that to get us over this initial hurdle where we'll be more expensive that are super important. The other thing that we can see, for example, in the shipping industry, we talk to a lot of shipping companies, and I think that it's the same. In fact, I was just on a panel with a local airline in Chile who are trying to do a lot towards decarbonizing through efficiency. And they said, look, we'd love to have sustainable aviation fuel and add that into our mix, but unless everyone does it, we're a low-cost airline, we compete on price, and our clients won't come to us if we start charging them more money for their tickets. And so having that level playing field where you have a situation where all of the airlines need to incorporate a certain amount of this fuel, and actually someone had a really good analogy that in Chile, the dominant bread choice is called marraqueta. It's kind of like a bread roll, and it used to have a lot of salt. And at one point, the Bakers Association got together and said, you know what, this is not healthy. People are eating a lot of salt. We need to try and reduce that amount of salt. But they knew that if they did it overnight, then there would be a riot on their hands because everyone would hate the taste of their bread. And so bit by bit, year by year, they went reducing the amount of salt until now it's a much healthier type of salt, and we didn't have any bread riots on the streets of Santiago. So I think that in industries that are hard to abate, such as the aviation sector and the shipping sector, it's really important to take the same approach. We can't overnight require everyone to have 100% sustainable fuel. There'll be a riot. But what we can do is progressively increase those standards and maintain a level playing field so that people who want to do the right thing can do that, and you know, gradually we'll transition to a lower carbon transport sector.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to echo, you know, a lot of different pieces of the puzzle have to fall into place. We have to commercialize hydrogen production, direct air capture. We have to build related infrastructure and then bring it all to the scale that we need. So maybe I think I want to clarify one thing with you, Jonathan. So there's the direct air capture. There's airlines investing in the first of a kind projects for the tons captured from the air, but there's also the fuels production. So how would you evaluate, and what's maybe the evolution of the strategy over the long term that we think would be ideal for decarbonization and lead to fuels shifting?
That's a great question, and a complicated one from our perspective. We're sort of grappling with some of those questions of what's the best use for this technology. Right now we need fuel. We need fuel that's compatible with existing systems. Ultimately, we may be able to move into other types of airframes, other types of propulsion systems that can use hydrogen or some other hydrogen-based fuels. But right now, we need high compatibility and direct air capture supported derived fuels, like the kinds that Clara's company are making, are very promising on that front. The question is, and it's a question we've talked about with carbon engineering, it's a question we've debated internally at CATF, is if you have direct air capture technology, is it more efficient to take that carbon, put it into fuels, or is it more efficient to take that carbon, put it underground, and allow the aviation sector to continue burning petroleum? We're still grappling with that. I wish I had a better answer for you. Certainly, the process to synthetic fuels that companies like HF are pursuing gives us a lot more certainty about what's happening. The accounting processes around offsets have been fairly bad so far, and so it doesn't give us great confidence that an offset-based regime for addressing aviation emissions is something that we can fully rely on to get the emissions from that sector that we need.
Thank you. And I actually have a follow-up question right on this life cycle emissions analysis. How are you both looking at this? What are you expecting from governments or independent certification? How important? When can we expect it? How will it inform policy?
I'll go quickly. Life cycle analysis is absolutely essential to all these fuels. It's incredibly complicated in the context of biofuels. Biofuels, the emissions from a biofuel system is, they're the same or even higher than they are from a petroleum system. the credits that you are attributing to that system are not measurable. I mean, sorry, the emission reductions that are attributed to that system are not measurable. You have to model them. You have to sort of essentially do some very fancy guessing at what those emission reductions were and then credit that back to the fuel. The tools that we use to do that type of analysis, at least with respect to biofuels, have to take into account a whole bunch of complicated systems, like what's happening on the landscape in multiple agricultural economies. And it has to make some very large, very important assumptions on what the alternative fate of that land would have been in the absence of demand for biofuels. It's a really complicated process. We're a long ways from perfecting that, and so these life cycle analysis questions are especially potent and especially challenging in the context of aviation. In the context of biofuels, and it's one of the reasons why CATF and others have suggested this move away from biofuels, not just because there is insufficient supply, but the reductions that are potentially attributable to biofuels are highly uncertain. With respect to synthetic fuels or hydrogen, there's a set of issues. Most of those emissions can be measured, and so there's a much higher degree of certainty around the net life cycle emissions. But Clara can probably speak more to this than I can. So.
Yeah, I think I'd just echo that it is extremely important that this is transparent, that the certification process is, believed in by people who look at it, because otherwise, really the whole industry loses credibility. And so we've been working with, experts in building life cycle analysis. I agree that it's much easier to do with e-fuels because you have a limited set of inputs. You can look at how much carbon it's taking for you to capture the carbon dioxide that you're using. The transport of the fuels and things like that, it really is very easy to measure. And I guess just a comment that there will need to be, there's not that many certification agencies around now, so we'll need to probably have growth in that industry. Again, making sure that the people who are doing that are credible, that there are standards that are easily understood by people, and that people could compare apples to apples and not get lost in kind of a mix of varying standards and approaches to things. So that will require collaboration as that industry grows to make sure that everyone is using the same measuring stick to be able to measure the carbon intensity as we go forward.
Great, thank you. And I want to go into the audience. Please, when you're asking your questions, state your name and affiliation.
Hi, my name is Natasha from UK, riding on the life cycle analysis and getting back on the airframe. I wonder do you consider to take into account how this new airframe also considered to be measured their environmental and economical impact, so that we have a more holistic overview of how the life cycles of not only the fuel but also the new airframe are you consider that?
That's a great question. If we assume that economic development will lead to more air travel, presumably that means more airplanes, which means more inputs, aluminum, steel, some of the complicated metals that go into advanced turbines, particularly if those are turbines that are running high hydrogen fuels. So there are challenges there that need to be taken into consideration. I suspect, but I don't know, that the mass material inputs for the growth in the aircraft themselves are manageable compared to some of the other metal and mineral challenges that are present in the energy transition of transportation, particularly batteries and to some extent fuel cells and electrolyzers. But there's certainly something that we'll take into consideration. One of the great things about aluminum airframes is that the aluminum is recyclable, and so it doesn't pose some of the same challenges as some of these other minerals that are very hard to get and very hard to recycle.
I guess I might just make one comment about one of the beauties of carbon-based e-fuels as compared to things like hydrogen and even electrification is that you can use your existing fleet. And so that, on the one hand, reduces the carbon emissions of doing, I guess, new vehicles of whatever type. But it also means that the pace of change can be a lot faster. If you're waiting for everyone to go out and buy a new plane, then that process is going to take decades. If you're waiting for everyone even just to go out and buy a new car, that's going to take decades. And so the beauty of these carbon-based fuels, which are the same as fossil fuels, is that we can just plug them in straight away and start using them. So there's savings in terms of the infrastructure, being able to use the infrastructure that exists today, and also just an ability to accelerate much more than if you're waiting for the whole system to transition across to new equipment.
Hiya, my name's Ben. Thank you for presenting, it's pretty good. I was really excited to see you scaling the synthetic fuels. I wanted to ask, so to do with the certification of your methanol-based system with carbon dioxide, surely if you're creating something that's chemically similar to kerosene and the Fischer-Tropsch process is accepted as, yes, you've made it that way, what is different about your final product that means that you have trouble with this? What is your limiting factor?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Unfortunately, the International Air Transport Association takes a bit of a firmer view on that. So obviously airline transport is a risky proposition and we all want to be safe when we fly, myself included. And so they take an approach that every new pathway to producing aviation fuel needs to be very rigorously tested. There are some fast tracks. So, for example, if you're only going to blend up to 10% of airline fuel, then you can have a faster evaluation process, which allows you to start doing that ahead of going through the more rigorous one where you have to test things in engines for a certain period of time and go through all the different participants in the industry, which can take a couple of years. And so given that, even with a big plant, we're producing kind of a drop in the ocean in terms of the overall use of airline fuel, that's the approach that we're taking, is to go with the accelerated pathway and get that as soon as possible and work on the other one. And, hopefully that can move quite quickly. I know that there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of focus from all participants in the airline industry to try and get as many options as they can. But obviously safety is the first priority and we need to make sure that we're doing everything, in a way that keeps people comfortable.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Spencer from the American Chemical Society. I understand that these two are very linked, but what do you feel is a bigger challenge limiting SAF development? Is it financial availability or current infrastructure shortcomings?
So I might take that. I think that there is a lot of money floating around the world to invest in the energy transition. Whether you're talking about investment funds or banks, people have hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars sitting on their balance sheet ready to invest in the energy transition. But what you need to be able to unlock all of that capital is a well-structured project. So you need to be able to tick all of the boxes that you need to tick, and maybe the banks might be willing to not put their glasses on too much when they're looking at some of the risks in the interest of moving things forward, but you will need to more or less fit within that box of acceptable risk for the banks to then deploy that money and the funds as well. And so that's really the key to being able to get these projects up and running quickly. Is, okay, where is the technological risk? How can we mitigate that? So we're trying to use technologies that are as established as possible, because it can be really tempting to do things that look great and are more advanced, but in the end you just can't get the financing for those technologies. So we try and put together elements that are as proven as possible, and where really the only new thing is that we're putting it all together in the same place. You need to have construction companies that have the balance sheet to be able to build these things in a way that the banks can trust. And so there's not that many construction companies out there who can build a $6 billion project and have it on their balance sheet and give you the guarantees that you need. And it will not be perfect, so there's some structuring that's need to be done around that. The good news is that there is an industry that went from pretty much zero to, I think I just saw the numbers today, $42 billion per year of investment expected for next year, which is the LNG industry. And so a lot of the things that we're looking at as we think about the rollout of these e-fuel projects at a large scale are the same challenges that have been resolved in the context of LNG projects, which can sometimes go up to being, multi-billion dollar projects, $10, $20 billion projects. And they've found good ways of being able to deal with risk and structure around it. And so we're trying to draw as much as possible from the lessons that have been learned in that sector, apply it here. We will need some creativity and some new solutions for some of the risks to be able to mitigate them. But we feel very comfortable that if we do a good job with that and we have a very well-structured project, the liquidity will certainly be there for us to be able to build.
I don't have anything to add. That was really useful. I'm not developing projects, so I think you get the best answer you're going to get on that.
All right. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this really amazing panel, really insightful. I just want to give a few personal key takeaways. I think what we've learned from Jonathan is the vast majority of people globally are not flying today, and the decarbonization of the aviation sector is hugely complicated. It ties into reimagining the global fuels markets for zero carbon fuels. A lot of different technologies and pieces have to fall into place to create new fuels. Biofuels are not a reliable strategy. Massive expansion plus diversion away from other sectors where we're already using these fuels. They're already almost at the ceiling, plus huge environmental impacts. We need better LCA certification, CI disclosure. Transparency is the key to credibility. And then, of course, we need to complete the policy framework so we can really enable this whole infrastructure and technology ecosystem around fuels production to be commercialized. Thank you very much. I think Jonathan and Clara will be here to answer further questions, and we're going to continue our programming actually in just 25 minutes with EU Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson.